Jack, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really excited. You're my first podcast 2022.
And you're my first podcast ever.
There you go. Well, certainly in 2022. Yes. I don't know if that's much of an honor to bestow on someone being my first podcast of the year, but I'm very honored myself to do this. I'm excited. You've got a book that's coming out. We've been talking about that for a while, behind the scenes and stuff, but I wanted to have you come and talk about that. But maybe at the beginning, at the top of this, we could maybe have a bit of an overview. Who are you? Why are you here? But maybe a bit of like how you got here as well, if you could throw that in the mix.
Well, I don't know if it's best to go chronologically, but probably at the heart of it is I'm a business transformation consultant. Now, why I got interested in this was because and deconstruction more generally, was because I grew up evangelical. I actually had a good evangelical experience. As I got older, it became more spiritual, less religious, and increasingly saw how Christianity was mutating to be a little bit more toxic, a little bit more political, kind of decade by decade.
Sure.
And I always felt I was kind of an evangelical at heart, I would say. Wasn't extremely dogmatic, but I always wanted to kind of figure it out. And so as I got older, I wanted to take a bit of time, take a look at the faith, look at it not like a theologian or a clergy member, because there are plenty of people looking at it from those perspectives.
Right.
I felt like there was not going to be progress in those ways, because it's hard to change something that you're paid to defend. And that's kind of the dilemma. So I looked at Christianity for myself, but also to try to lay it out in more of an independent way, possibly for others, to look at it as a system, and then look at it independently as a system, so that you could then peel away what doesn't seem to make sense. And so I think, with your audience, in your statistics, I think 78% or so want to keep some aspect of their faith as they deconstruct. Some don't want any aspect of it, and there are plenty of reasons for that. And so really what the book does is go through my journey of, what's the problem of Christianity? Because it is declining, by any measure.
Yeah.
It is getting more toxic by any measure as moderates begin to leave and fundamentalists stay. And it has, I think, really failed to grow as a spiritual practice. I think, when you look at other, 20% of people in the US consider themselves spiritual but not religious. And it's not that it couldn't be much more spiritual, because Jesus, even in the Bible, the kind of the key priorities were very spiritual in nature.
Yeah.
But of course, that doesn't translate very well into the dogma. And I guess what I found was that you're kind of taught, because of it is a business system, you're kind of taught that dogma is the foundation of the faith, but it's really the foundation of the business model of the faith. And so when you look at the faith through those eyes, it becomes clearer how the system can get corrupted. And so, like the two key things that occur are and it's done in a variety of ways, as you know, don't trust your thoughts. and our church knows the one true way. And you combine those two things, and it gives a leader power that almost nobody else could have.
Right.
And then, of course, bad things can happen when that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're a business guy, right? You go from the business world, and if you suggested that was in place in a business, people would very quickly be trying to shut that person down. That organization would need a massive overhaul. And yet, it's kind of, even if you say that to a fundamental conventional Christian, if you said, oh, well, Christianity kind of holds that you probably shouldn't trust your thoughts, and you should definitely trust the dogma of the church. The church you're in is right, and it knows what's right for you. Even most Christians would go, yeah, no, I'm not sure we can trust our thoughts. We need to trust Jesus, and the church is the one that, these kind of things. Like, it sounds like an obvious red flag, but actually, even if you said the red flag word for word, many Christians would be like, yes, correct. That is right. Yes, that's what we believe. And do you know what I mean? Some red flags, you go, oh yeah, this organization, suggests that it's okay for a man to be in a closed room with this minor and lock the door. You're like, okay, suddenly almost any person, even Christian, even a pedophile is kind of going, that's not okay.
Right.
Everyone's going, that's a big red flag. But the church almost defends its red flags that you're putting forth, which is a fascinating dynamic. I wonder if you could, so there's so much there that this will be the podcast, right? Touching on all of that world, we'll be kind of unpacking. But something that you said really early on that really fascinated me was that you had a good experience of evangelicalism. And I know for many people that kind of track different metrics of people starting to leave, starting to see evangelicalism as toxic. We were talking to Dr. Tina Shermer-Sellers, who works with people who have major sexual issues in their marriages. She said that she suddenly saw this huge burst in her Christian clientele. And when she tracked it back, it was people that were starting to go through puberty in the early 90s, which is when the purity culture started. And that was for her, she was like, kids that grew up in evangelicalism before that didn't have all these sexual issues and sexual trauma and ghosts of the past and things that we're bringing into their relationships moving forward. But starting the 90s, it kicked off. And so she saw the 90s being very key as a shift in evangelicalism. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. Other people might go, well, the moral majority coming in was a big thing. I'm intrigued because obviously, I don't want to out you, but anyone watching the video, you've got a few more gray hairs than me. So I'm assuming you've probably got a decade or two on me. What kind of shifts were you seeing? Because I'm really intrigued by this. When do you think you started to, even though you were like, I've got a good evangelical experience, I know that evangelicalism in and of itself wasn't the problem. Something happened within evangelicalism, or at least for me, that was how you perceived it. That's how I'm hearing you in some ways. Could you talk about the shifts and some of the main points that you see as where the problems came in, or why the problems came in for you?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a couple of dimensions. I think evangelicalism is a brand. It's not a faith. And so even within evangelicalism, it really depends on your church. And while denominations do influence on the Protestant side, of course, there's a lot more consistency on the Catholic side. But the whole thing about my one true way, for instance, Christians can see it in other Christians. They can see, well, that church is off track, but they just can't see it in their own because it gets isolated at a church level. So you can have a very toxic church, a very loving church. But when you put in the element of time, which is, I think, at the heart of your question, there was, I would say, a purity. So let's go back even, because I grew up when I was a teenager in the 70s. And so there was still a purity culture, and even the world had more of a purity culture at that point in time. Woodstock had happened, and so it was less so. But it industrialized purity culture. And I think what you're talking about in the 90s was an industrialization of it. And I think that industrialization was made possible by the 80s and the moral majority, Ronald Reagan, that it began to be more of a less of a spiritual practice and more of a political process. And so, and then of course, the Falwells and all of that. And so it really, as you pointed out well, and the whole Christian nationalism movement, it has become very political, but what's enabled it to become very political is that it's become very industrial.
Yes.
At that level. But that's still, but what's really, to me, fascinating about it is that when you look at Christianity overall, even evangelicalism, you come from a charismatic background. I came from a non-charismatic background. They did join together under Trump in the United States. And they were able to do that because of the system behind it.
Yeah.
Because in the old days, they wouldn't have been able to do that. They wouldn't have been able to see that they were part of the same group. And so there has been this industrialization. Purity culture is a good example. But all of it, but then again, my good experience, I was a straight white male. And and that has a lot to do with people who are defecting and people who are getting more and more militant, as we look at 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really insightful. I think, you mentioned it in just industrialization. I read a statistic somewhere and I can't remember the exact details, but I do remember them saying that the purity culture movement is almost, I think it's just shy of being $1 billion industry, which is astonishing to me that you can sell that many purity rings and true love weights Bibles and whatever else. But I mean, and you look at it on that level and you suddenly realize, wow, okay, so there is a lot of people in the purity culture movement that aren't doing this for money. I'd say, in fact, most people probably aren't doing it for money. But what's fascinating is there's definitely some people in here that are doing it for some money, or at least have a lot of money to lose if it goes away.
Yeah, and that's all it takes.
That's all it takes. It's the same deal, right? It's that, most people working for Amazon are probably really good people. But is Amazon doing some really harmful things to the world? Yes. And do some people near the top, high stockholders or whatever, have a lot of money to lose if Amazon decides to change some of its practices to do less harm in the world? Yeah. And that's all it takes. It doesn't matter how many good people are involved, actually. There's enough few powerful people here that aren't going to change that dynamic. And it feels like that's a big part of evangelicalism. These huge names, these big Christian celebrity pastors. You mentioned the Falwells. I won't mention names too much, but these big identities that at a certain point, some of them you do think you feel like you're much more. I mean, the fact that it was Gangster Capitalism's podcast did a series on the Falwells, it's like they're not even a Christian deconstruction. They're a let's comment on the problems within capitalism. And they picked a Christian university to talk about. Like that says it all. It says that there is these kind of very problematic late stage capitalism, whatever people's views of capitalism are, but these late stage problematic components are definitely there on the church level, where it is a bit of a money making machine for some people. That's not to discredit the millions of probably Christians around the world that have no desire to make money out of church. And that includes a lot of pastors that are just there trying to help people and visit people in hospitals and pray for them when they're, go through a miscarriage or their kids are struggling, or, there's a lot of great people in this. You and I would be on the same page as that. And really what I see your book being, and a lot of what you're talking about is it's the system. There's a system that plays on the intentions of good people and maybe corrupts a lot of that good and turns it maybe into a mechanism that does harm a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, well, Christianity in the United States is a $124 billion industry.
Wow.
And when you throw in Christian nationalism and the political side of it, they're actually related, but a little bit different. But the same industrialization enables both of them. And that is, there are relatively few people who call the shots. And that's true with any hierarchy. And they are able to conflate interests by taking advantage of those two things we talked about before, as far as don't trust your own thoughts, trust your leader. And your leader knows the one true way, and then corralling those leaders, politically, has always been tempting, from Constantine on. And so that's just how it has evolved. And as it evolves, moderates are dropping out, radicals are staying in, and the church itself is declining. And there's a lot of good that is at risk because of, really relative dogma is another story, but in terms of leadership and stuff like that, relatively few bad apples, but it doesn't take a lot of them when you got mega churches and major organizations and major political organizations. A very few people can manipulate, 2.3 billion, around the world.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, when I was in the charismatic kind of world, I was part of a charismatic church and I had charismatic friends. And what's fascinating to me was there was this dynamic where we looked to the charismatic superheroes, your Bill Johnsons, your whoever, these big charismatic names from Hillsong, Bethel, Morning Star, big, mostly Americanized mega churches. With these very super powerful, wealthy people, all white males, and usually white older males, right? I mean, it's just like they all tick the patriarchy box, really, don't they? But I remember thinking many times my pastor would say things in the pulpit, and I talked to my friends afterwards, or we talk in leadership things, and a lot of people would be like, "Yeah, but Bill thinks differently," referencing someone like Bill Johnson, or "Oh, I heard differently from Rick Joyner over in Morningstar," and they would place these big super Christians above their own pastor, which, hey, I'm all for us using our own personal autonomy to figure out who should have the most authority as a spokesperson, right? I think that's the problem with some of Christianity is we look to the pastor over, our doctor or something, like some of these cults that don't give their kids medicine because their pastor says don't give medicine, or, so I'm all for us thinking about these things and deciding who should have more of authority. But I see that being a mechanism at play more and more, where people aren't even trusting their own pastor. They're kind of jumping the gun to these people that are in these huge, powerful positions. It's very problematic. I think of the difference in America and the US as well. America, the US and the UK. And I think, the US is always, growing up in the UK, we always kind of looked down on America. And we would very much be like, oh, that they're
people do
money,
that. So.
Money grabbing business. Like that's how we saw pastors. Even when pastors came over to the UK to do a revival meeting or something, we'd be like, well, they're just there for the money. Now we maybe were on the button, and maybe a lot of times we weren't. I'm sure a lot of people came over with really good intents to, save the UK, which was rapidly becoming an atheist agnostic nation. But a lot of them were constantly asking for money, constantly, doing offerings and things like that. And so we saw a lot of that as a big business, money kind of organization, where a lot of churches in the UK don't operate like that at all. Most churches don't, say you have to tithe. Most churches don't get bigger than, a big church, a really successful church in the UK is 100 people. That's doing really well. And so we didn't have those kind of mechanisms where organizations kind of sprawled out of control and took over. In fact, most churches in the UK, the pastor is very much subjected to the authority of the members. The members, deacons, elders. There's that structure for sure. And there is a hierarchy. Of the higher up, you got more power. And the pastor had a lot of power, absolutely. But he was still beholden to the power of the members through elders and deacons. And I was constantly amazed when I went to America and saw that mechanism was very much turned upside down. It was very much the pastor was all powerful and the elders and the deacons did his bidding. It wasn't that they kept him in check as much as they kind of did. They administered to what he wanted to do. Right. And it was much more like a business, right? It was much more like a CEO talking to his underlings, the middle managers and heads of departments. But in the UK, it felt much more, it was a CEO beholden to a board that was going to keep him in check and he'd be gone if it wasn't too good, right? And that has always surprised me. And I think I've hit a few roadblocks actually talking to Christians in the UK because a lot of them don't see that mechanism at play. And so all that to say, I think, the Christianity is so broad. And like you said, evangelical is so broad. And I think predominantly what we're talking about is the mechanisms in play that turn Christianity and evangelicalism into a business, basically, on some level, or certainly a powerful organization where very few people are in charge and call the shots. So you have a business background. You're very successful in business. I remember the first time we talked and I Googled you afterwards and I was like, wow, this guy's been around. He's done a lot in business. You know what you're talking about when it comes to business organizations. You do a lot of consultation with large organizations. Was there a process in your rising through the ranks in business and starting to learn how organizations operated that you saw a similar dynamic coming into play in Christianity? Like how did that come about? It sounds like it wasn't necessarily the case early on that Christianity was always kind of ran as that sort of business structure. Is that fair to say, or was it always pretty much a business model?
I think it was always a business model in that there were always hierarchies. What's different is, in my mind, and Protestant and Catholic, it's different because of the decentralized nature of being a Protestant versus the centralized nature of being a Catholic.
Sure.
And so the hierarchy in Catholicism has been pretty consistent, from the beginning, but it has its challenges, obviously, as well, as you know. What's different in terms of, if you go back to the 70s versus now with the Protestant church, is that the denominations don't have the power that they used to have. And I think denominations tended to be a little bit more benevolent and more interactive, in my opinion. What really changed, and it gets to what you were talking about in terms of like religious thought leaders and, kind of going over the head in a lot of ways, the local minister, Christian radio, Christian television, and the megachurch. And it started in my, as I look at it, it started with people like Norman Vincent Peale and Robert Schuller, who at that point, the Crystal Cathedral was like the ultimate Protestant megachurch. It was like, unbelievable, and he started doing things on television, the 7 or Hour of Power, in the 700 Club, was sort of happening, all of these things. And so you started getting very few people with a very big voice.
Yeah.
And then when the megachurch occurred, and there's stuff in the book about that, but that really industrialized the church for Jesus in a lot of respects. And there were people involved in that worked with the Heibels of the world and, the Rick Warrens of the world. And I think their hearts were probably good originally, but, and maybe, I guess they all have different situations right now. So I'll assume everybody's heart's good. What gets to the problem is the hierarchy. And what you're talking about in terms of people who want to do whatever somebody's telling them to do, that happens in business all the time. You know, if you're the CEO in a meeting, you just have to look. And so let's say you got 12 other people. You just have to look a certain way, and they'll take that cue and run with it. And so there's something about hierarchy that has a tremendous amount of influence when you're working with people. And so, and that's true in every company, but it becomes much more deliberate when you got a congregation of 30,000 people, and they don't need denominations, right? So it's just a matter of, even if 80% are being absolutely perfect, the 20% in the 80-20 rule can kill you. And it doesn't take a lot of corruption to a lot of corrupt people to create a tremendously corrosive environment. And dogma kind of enables that, because you have this unprovable and unchallengeable stuff, and people often use that to control others.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, Jack, because I know that this is a huge portion of your book. So we're mentioning the book, we're touching on the book. Do you want to give a little introduction to what the book is, so that people kind of have an idea of what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's a book that lays out a way to independently deconstruct the faith as a system, and so it breaks it down into how the system of Christianity works at a personal level, and so that people can make their own choice in terms of, you know, where they go from here, because it's something that even, you know, a lot of your research and you personally and a lot of other people in the deconstruction space, I mean, there's just a lot of trauma and a lot of confusion, because the system is so confusing that it's kind of like it's you against God or something, you know, when you start to move away from a particular church. And so the book itself deconstructs the faith like I deconstructed it. So full disclosure, it may not be for everybody. In fact, I know it won't be for everybody. But it looks at it from an independent perspective, and it looks at it through the eyes of somebody who grew up as an evangelical. So when I deconstruct the system, I deconstruct it linked to the Bible, in the same way that people who oppress others link their oppression to the Bible. So that if you were having a discussion with somebody who had not deconstructed, you could give them a biblical and structural articulation of what you're thinking, and then it kind of goes through it kind of goes through my journey, which was a much more of a spiritual process, just as an example. And then it goes on to, if you were going to, part of the problem is the church, if you were going to deconstruct a church, and there are 300,000 churches, Christian churches in the United States, there are only 14,000 McDonald's. And so when you look at, and there will be tens of thousands of these churches who go under with the current trends because of the fixed overhead. So churches have a choice too. And is there a way to rethink the church in a way that's less focused on dogma, more on what Jesus said was most important, with, you know, love, connection, service, and less about the sanctuary and buildings and more about the streets, which would also be more like Jesus. And to do that, you have to be run more like an effective and an efficient nonprofit organization, which most churches probably are not. And so at that level, it 2/3 of the book is about the individual to kind of think through their own thought process. Then there's a bit on what would a deconstructed church look like, because there are, I think your research points out as well, like 60% people in the church are deconstructing. And so as you start looking at, what the implications of that are, that's something to consider. If you've got 300,000 of these things, in the United States alone, and you've got 2.3 billion Christians around the world, and they're all kind of struggling with the business model not working anymore. And then there's a Christian Snapshot piece, which you've been very kind to help with as well. Where's part of the problem that I've seen with deconstruction is it's just hard to have a language around it. It's so complicated when you try to deal with it at the theology level, because you've got all these other things going on beyond your particular church's set of beliefs. And so it becomes like, this and that and this and that and that, and this person said that, and, all of that. And so when you look at it as a system, part of what can, I think, help people who are deconstructing is just to look at their own belief system, whatever it happens to be, have it laid out on a common framework using a common language, see how they have shifted so that they can explain it to somebody else, and then have whoever their peer is, who they're talking to, they can take it to. It's all free, and you can start to create a language of what your belief system really is around, what's supernatural, how oriented are you toward the supernatural versus the literalistic versus the humanistic versus the contemplative. And in 5 to 10 minutes, you can go through it. You can see, where you ended up. You can see, you can use it to see where you started and where you are today, so that you can even in your own mind clarify. Because it took me years to clarify in my own mind what I believed, and I was looking at it without a lot of trauma. And so it's a very healthy process. So I think the Christian Snapshot is an important part of it. I think people should take the Christian Snapshot even if they don't read the book. But when you were kind enough to have some of your folks look at it, what was really interesting to me was that, and it was very consistent with my own journey, that people largely who have deconstructed and you are good about saying they still want to be a Christian. So it kind of goes back, to that 78% who still want to keep some part of their faith. But their shift had been from supernatural and literalistic, so very dogmatic religion, more towards contemplative and humanistic, and so much more like Jesus, but then also much less dogmatic as well. And so there's just a lot of good information and discussion starters and things like that people can begin to just sort through, where they are, where they want to go.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that the Christian Snapshot, we worked on it right from fairly early stages, and I did it where I did it against myself in the past. I answered as I would have as a very excited, passionate, conventional Christian, someone that was teaching Christianity and showing people how to be a good Christian. And then I did it today of like, what my values, what do I find important? And I found things like, what does the Bible say? I don't really care anymore, do I need to see this supernatural thing? Or, I saw that same shift in myself. But one of the things I thought that was really fascinating about it is you didn't, I don't know if I could have got my dad to do it and then send me the results, because he would be like, hey, what's up here? You know, what's going on?
Sure, right,
but I could probably answer on some level for my dad, roughly guessing where he's at. And just looking at the data it put out, you go, oh, that topic is a topic we believe very strongly about together. We both agree that we should be serving our fellow human and trying to better their lives. And I'm like, wow, why am I having so many arguments with my dad about what the Bible really says? I could be talking about how much we love to help the poor and how we can help, you know, bring more clean water to this region, or how we could, you know, feed people through food banks or something like that. And we'd have a great conversation for 2 hours, and it'd be a brilliant family visit instead of the crazy, terrible family visit. Now, if my dad's listening, he's like, but like, we don't have a problem. Analogy. Okay. I know my dad jumps on this every now and again. As soon as I said my dad, I'm like, oh, this is a terrible analogy. Because if he's listening, he's going to be like, what are you talking about? But, you know, like these dynamics of, I often say, you know, like we get so fixated on, because we've gone through such radical changes, it's very easy for us to look at the areas we've changed and really demonize those parts of us. And we see that in our family, in our old friends, and we demonize that because it reminds us of who we used to be that we don't like. But actually, we can also look at our family and our friends and go, let's look at some of the other parts of them that maybe we don't need to demonize, and it actually can bring us closer. And actually, I think as we work on those areas and as we develop and kindle those relationships further, maybe we can now have a bit more of a healthy conversation about the Bible. You know, maybe we can now have a bit more of a healthy conversation about, you know, the nature of God or something like that. But yeah, I think it's fantastic. But the book, I mean, I think it's a fantastic resource. I would iterate, again, largely for people that are wanting to hold on to some of their Christian faith. But like you said, and the data bears up on this, you know, a good portion, about 30% of people at Deconstruct still identify as Christian. Like they just are happy with the title Christian. That's a very big number. It's a big number. I was quite surprised it was so high, because I know a lot of people go, well, yeah, but I don't like to call myself Christian though, like that the term is stigmatized. And I was surprised. And then another chunk of people will go, well, I don't like to identify as Christian, and I don't like the church and the organization and these things, but I do like Jesus. I really like Jesus. I like some of what he taught us. And I think the book targets these two people really well, because finding yourself in that place where you want to hold on to something of faith, it's a bit like wanting to hold on to the relationship with your dad's, right? And he reminds you of all the bits you don't believe anymore. And it's hard. It's hard to be in a relationship when your dad brings up, you know, how he loves Trump, or you know, how he doesn't understand. We gave black people the vote. Why else do they want? And you're like pulling your hair out going, what are you talking about? It's really hard for you to also go, oh yeah, but me and my dad both love the Red Sox. And we also, you know, help at the food bank, you know, feeding the homeless, you know, like there's these commonalities and things that make my dad a great person. And I think this is very much doing that practice for Christianity. This is how I felt when I was reading it. I was going, oh, this is helping me to identify what parts of Christianity I really do struggle with. I really do think there are problems. I think my journey tracked a lot with yours. I think a lot of Christians will track with you. Like you said, it's your journey, so it won't be identical, but a lot of the problems in Christianity are probably quite common across the board for people. And people will go, yeah, I don't understand how God could really be good if that's the way that works. Or I don't really understand how, whatever, the Bible is inerrant when this is how it was written or whatever. But it also starts to highlight there is stuff in there, though, that I really do love. And I think that's a problem for a lot of people that want to stay Christian, is they struggle with that balance and navigating that whole process. It's just a really tricky thing to do. It's really, really hard. I think you did really well with it. I really love it. But one of what's the name of your book, Jack?
Christianity Without Dogma.
I mean, that, first of all, it sounds like a dream. It sounds like a bit of a fairy tale as well, maybe a bit of an oxymoron. What's that? My brain. Never mind. The words just immediately escaped me as I said.
Oxymoron works.
Yeah. But like, you know, it sounds amazing for most people that grew up in Christianity. If you take the dogma out, and you're left with Jesus, following the path of Jesus, living a life like Jesus, loving people like Jesus. I think most atheists would say that's probably a relatively healthy thing to do. They might pick here and there and go, I don't like that about Jesus, or I don't think that's right, or I don't kind of like the person of Jesus because he was a bit too this or a bit too that. But on the whole, most people, when you go, what do you think about the person of Jesus? Do you think someone that looked like Jesus would be a good person? They'd be like, yeah, that'd be a pretty good person. I think we could all be a bit better looking like Jesus. I think it's something we all want to, all of us coming from Christianity can recognize there are good parts within us that came from growing up in Christianity to some degree. And I think your book is a really helpful tool in integrating some of that stuff. Sorry, I was just rambling, but I know you want to jump in, so go for it.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that when you look at dogma, and so I'll just say dogma is something that is unprovable and unchallengeable, as a starting point. So there are a host of things under it, but there are a lot of ways to relate to dogma. And so when you look at, even some of the closely held things, I think it can be helpful to ask, if I didn't know this was true, would it really make that big of a difference? And to think about the Bible not as the foundation of the faith, because the Bible came in late. It's only been around for 500 years or so, but as an input to the faith, a history of the faith. And so you can relate to dogma in a variety of levels. And I think this is where a lot of your work on spiral dynamics has been so brilliant. And I think a lot of it can be applied here, that you can take these things that are in the Bible, and the first thing is, what's the model that you're using to interpret it? And you can use, in the model that I use in the book, is what did Jesus in the Bible prioritize as most important? And it came down, at least in this model, to love, connection, service. So if you read the Bible through a lens of love, connection, service, and in a Jesus-centric way, what does the Bible say to you? Now, you can just as easily as use a different model, and a lot of people do, and interpret the Bible quite differently. But that is a choice. And it's not a choice that comes down from God. It's a choice that men have created, and so that's really part of it. I would say, when I went through the process, I went through it in a spiritual but not religious mindset, a fundamentalist mindset, and an atheistic mindset or a rationalist mindset. And I looked at it three different ways. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, that even atheists would think Jesus was a pretty good guy. There's a beauty of rationalism that is actually part of the solution, I think, to making Christianity better than it is. And so one of the things that, declared atheists struggle with, and usually they're atheists in the sense that the definition that Christians have given God makes so little sense that they just can't accept that. And so they just go on. But unfortunately, that filters into a whole bunch of different things within the church. But they starve for traditions. They starve for community, and they are often spiritual but not religious. Even with Sam Harris with Waking Up with his meditation app is wonderfully spiritual. Yet he's kind of at the vanguard of religious criticism and atheism. And I think we should actually listen to some of those debates that happened after 9/11. And I think we can all learn from them. And so I do think rationalism matters. I think you can relate to dogma in a variety of ways. And kind of to your spiral dynamics, you can relate to dogma at a variety of levels.
Yes.
And the same dogma, when you look at it literalistically, and you look at it with a business model that's based on original sin, can mean something quite different from a verse when you're looking at it through the lens of love, connection, and service. And you're looking at it at a more spiritual, humanistic, contemplative in that way, instead of whatever your fundamentalist minister, says it says.
Yeah. I think, that's the key, isn't it? Like these kind of key components of love, connection, service, like everyone wants to be loved. Everyone wants to be connected to the people around them. And everyone at a core value wants to be able to serve other people. We're very generous by default, whether that's evolutionary, by creation, you could argue that all day, but by default, humans desire to do generous acts and serve those around them. The old adage of it's better to give than to receive, it comes from a very real raw place that maybe evolutionarily we survive because we give to the group, we give something of ourselves, we serve a function in the group, or maybe it's God going, I want them to be like me and I'm generous, whatever the reason. I think that we're all driven to have those three things within us. And I think those three things don't inherently have to be on any level religious. Most atheists I've ever met are very loving, very connected to people around them, and they serve their communities, other people, their families, their friends, strangers, and so I think those three things are really fascinating to me because they open up spiritual practices we might see and spiritual possibilities without them being tied to something that's deeply religious. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the division of spirituality and religion. For me, I would just say religion is dogmatic at its core. It's an organization driven by, the unprovable, whereas spirituality is just how we frame this world. And so like I leave it nice and open. Atheists frame the world. They have a spirituality and they engage in that level. But I am intrigued, by some dynamic, by some metrics, people would look at, what you put forth in the book. You kind of lay out, okay, so let's get rid of this dogma, but it's not serving us in a very positive way. It's unprovable anyway. If we can take this to the side and go, well, it's unprovable, so let's put it to the side. Christianity radically transforms overnight. It becomes a very different thing. I guess the question a lot of people would have is it Christianity still? What is it? Because if atheists are also able to practice this, if a Muslim can look at those tenets and practice it, they probably wouldn't identify as Christian. What would be the difference between that person and the person kind of engaging in kind of what you're deconstructing here? Because I know you'd identify as a conscious Christian, don't you? Which I think is a very beautiful way to put it, and I like that. A Christian from a much more conscious perspective than a dogmatic perspective. Sign me up every day. I want to talk to that one.
Right.
Yeah. So do you want to kind of touch on that? What you think about? Are you redefining Christianity? Are you giving a separate thing a label of Christianity? Because I know a lot of Christians would look at you and go, "Boy, he's just not a Christian, is he? Without original sin, without this, without that, you're not a Christian."
Right. So there's a lot there. One, we talked about spiritual versus religious. I think religion is sort of the organization that can activate something that's spiritual, and so you can be sort of and I think meditation is hugely important, but I think you can be spiritual and not make an impact. You can be religious and not be very spiritual, but if you can combine spirituality and organizational strength, then you can scale in a way that you can't possibly scale, as a lone ranger.
Absolutely.
So are you a Christian? Well, that depends how you define Christian. And that's not a new problem.
Mm-hmm.
And even within Christianity, there are many, many, many different denominations, and Christians do that to themselves. So it doesn't bother me that they would do that to me.
Right.
And so the question to me is, do you want a Christianity that looks more like the Pharisees in the New Testament, or do you want a Christianity that looks more like Jesus in the New Testament? And I think what this one does, when you start looking at law, a love fulfilling the law, and kind of the key things that Jesus represented, which I'll just say love, connection, and service for now, and not nitpick every single little verse in a Bible that was never designed to be written as a single body, is a way to take Christianity from something that's based on beliefs to something that is more of a spiritual practice, and that is much healthier at an individual level. And I'm hoping at some point could be much healthier at an organizational level.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, it hits the nail on the head that, we did this our whole lives as Christians, right? We always looked at the church down the roads and went, well, yeah, but they raise their hands when they worship, so they're not a real Christian. Or they've got a drum kit, they're not a real Christian. They've got a gay pastor, they're definitely not a real Christian. Whatever it was, right? And but I think what's interesting to me, the mechanism at play there was it wasn't individuals choosing who was a real or not real Christian. It was the organization. And I think what's fascinating about your model is it puts the ball in the individual's court and says, do you want to be a Christian or not? You get to choose how to build that framework, but do you want to build your life around this person, Christ? You can raise your hands whether you like it or not. If you worship, you can not worship. It's up to you. You do what you do, but it's in your control now. It gives power to the individual that has, for most of human history, while we've had Christianity, it's been in the power of some organization. I think that's it's a healthy evolution, right? It gives power to the autonomous person. If we talk spiral dynamics, it's a shift from blue to orange. It's suddenly like, whoa, I get to choose, I get to pick. Whoa. And that's scary. But then you realize, well, that's what the organization's been doing. They've been picking and choosing anyway. It's not like they had some actual, cheat sheet from God going, this is the right way to interpret the Bible. They've been just picking and choosing how to interpret the Bible as based on their organization. I think it's really fascinating. But I do know that I can imagine a lot of people that would be their first thing, especially Christians, would be, right now we'll put them over there with the progressive Christians, with the, whatever. Do you see yourself as a progressive Christian? When you see that kind of term thrown around, do you think that embodies kind of like where you're coming from?
I would say it's closer, but the whole, what's funny to me about, fundamentalists and, progressives aren't real Christians. And it's simply a manifestation of don't believe your thoughts and we have the one true way. And it's really no more than that. So if they're not you, they're not a real Christian. And so because, fundamentalists punch above their weight and have so much power, they tell their people that that's the slippery slope of being progressive. And their people begin to believe it. And so it spreads in that way. It's not, I don't think, true, but it is just something about the we know the one true way problem. I think it is more progressive, I would say. The one thing about but it might even be post-progressive, because progressive Christianity does whack off some of the rough edges of dogma, but it doesn't really challenge dogma at a fundamental level. And so I think what Christianity Without Dogma does is create a spiritual practice where you can define your faith based on what Jesus said was most important for a personal practice. And then if there are enough people who want to do that, then if they deconstruct a church, then you would have an organization who's saying to us, this is what Christianity means.
Yeah. A question for you, and I feel like this would be an interesting question because I know you live in the business world, but we talk about, one person does this and that's wonderful. And then they talk to their mates and they do it, maybe a few don't and they never see them again. But, a few people start to do this, and before long, there's 10 people, there's 20 people, there's 30 people, and they're getting together to talk about these things, to meditate together, to, volunteer or start a food bank or, homeless shelter or something. They're doing all these conscious, humanistic and, my brain, what's the fourth one? I'm clearly not awake today. Not supernatural, literous, contemplative. That's the one.
Yeah,
I went with it for the meditation, but yeah. So they're starting to do these things together. They're navigating towards basically starting a new movement, organization, something like that, right? Because you don't get 30 people together to feed the sick and to collect money, to buy shopping, to get all the foods, to get flyers out there so people that know that they can have somewhere to take care of or whatever. Like that doesn't really happen without a fair bit of organization, without some people taking responsibilities, these kind of things. And before long, you have something like maybe the progressive church, right? The people that were the fathers of the progressive church, these different figureheads, they were out on their own at some point, right? Just doing it, just them. They believed this and they were like, oh, no one else believes like this. And then people, turns out, did believe like that. And before long, they become these kind of organizations. But as you said, a lot of the time they can be a bit dogmatic. How do you perceive an organization? I know you touched on this a little bit in the book, but how do you perceive an organization running that isn't beholden to dogma, that doesn't go, well, this guy is in charge, this guy says the way it should be, that does almost stay kind of very horizontal, very flat, almost anarchistic in a way where every person has their own autonomous, valid say of what they believe, how they want to practice. To the average person that's grown up in a church, that sounds absolutely impossible. Like they couldn't even figure out how they would get together on a Sunday. How would it work? What would it look like? Do you see it working? Do you see church changing to be, I guess, there's two dynamics here, I guess. One is one emerging from people that have split from a church and it being created. And I think that's almost a completely separate thing. That sounds easier, but pretty damn hard. But the other option is, a church actually as a whole deconstructing, maybe leaders deconstructing. I think that's a whole other thing of leaders starting to go, hey, we're going to hold things much more open-handedly. And I've been a part of churches that have done that, and some have gone very well, and a lot have not gone well at all. And it's ended up with coups being thrown and all sorts of you could write movies. Honestly, it's crazy. But how do you see these kind of dynamics getting played out from an organizational perspective?
Organizationally, no one will change until they have to. That's just the nature of organizations. But you have in the US, as I mentioned before, 300,000. Probably 10 years from now, if they don't change, 10% of them will be out of business. And, if you take a look at the trends and start to extrapolate, then necessity is going to become the mother of invention. And so you can either double down on an old business model that's no longer working for you and struggle, or in those cases where you've got a collective group, and this kind of gets back to your statistic on, so many people who are in the church who are deconstructing. There can be an environment where just one group at a time possibly one church at a time, can retool these assets and retool them in a way that is more about the community and more about what's happening in the streets than it is about who's in charge within the organization itself. And I think there's a lot of promise in that. There's just so much tradition that can be leveraged. I think the body of Christian music, Christian tradition, Christian holidays, Christian, all of the in some cases, liturgy, none of it really needs unprovable and unchallengeable dogma. If you look at it in a lens of love, connection, and service. And so, will it be easy? No. Will it happen? Possibly not. Is it possible? I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it happen. I've had people on my podcasts where they are pastors of churches where it has happened and seen incredible things. I mean, even the church I was a part of before this, before I left it, the church I was a part of before I left it, that's a weird statement. They had pastors that were very much like, we don't want to be in the limelight. We don't need to be preaching every Sunday. We want other people in the congregation to preach. In fact, a lot of times we don't want anyone to preach. Let's have discussions. Let's pass mics around and chat and let's ask questions. But then there's not one person at front giving answers. We ask questions, but we give answers as we pass the mic around with different people sharing different thoughts about different. And it created such an open, healthy environment where people could share their fears, their doubts, but know that other people would immediately pick up and go, I've worried about that before as well, actually, and I'm quite concerned. Here's some things that have helped me, but I'm still worried as well. Does anyone else have thoughts? And it was such a beautiful environment where there was people in charge. There was people arranging the coffee and making sure there was a sound system, making sure that it happens. There were people meeting with people that were sick in hospital, and and different things. Some of those things needed structure, and they needed salaries, they needed whatever. Other things maybe didn't need that, and that could be even more decentralized as things went on. So it's possible, but it's really hard for a lot of people. I know a lot of people, even in that church, didn't see it as a good thing, right? They really struggled. Some people really didn't like that, when someone picked up a mic and said, well, what's the nature of eternal life? Do people go to hell or not? I'm freaking out because I just don't see how God can be good. If they pass that to a pastor, the pastor would be like, well, hell exists and this is why you got to burn in hell if you don't do this or whatever. Or maybe they'd say hell doesn't exist. I don't think it actually matters what they'd say. I think it mattered that there was one person to tell you and everyone would go, okay, good. But when that mic passed around and 8 different people shared 8 different views on the afterlife, the 9th person sat there going, I am freaking out because I want a answer. And not just the 9th person, maybe the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th person all starting to freak out. It's a big chunk of people. I think there's a component at play in the church where in some ways the system creates a dynamic where people need certainty. But I think in another way, people that need certainty have created the system. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a very chicken and egg situation on some level. And I think it's going to be really hard for a lot of people to do Christianity without dogma. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of people are very comfortable. And this is why when you talk about Christianity, a whole bunch of people go, well, you're not a Christian, because they need to know that I am a Christian. And if you're a Christian, I might not be. So I need to discredit you somehow. And I think that's the fascinating part about this is, and this goes for talking about race, talking about sexism, talking about all kinds of different issues, is the system is made up of people and the people have been shaped by the system. And so when we try and challenge these systems, when we try and change these systems or even completely destroy these systems, people get very defensive. People don't like it. And I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic to see how many churches manage to navigate that, to weather that. How many churches want to? I think, and so the church I mentioned, the church I was a part of, the reason we're no longer a part of it is eventually those pastors retired and There was an open, very, quite anarchistic, very horizontal leadership. Everyone was there. The whole church was like, who are we going to get as new pastors? Who's going to lead us? What are we going to do? And it went really south, ended up really backwards. And they basically went back to a very dogmatic way of doing church. And we were like, okay, well, we'll just leave then. But there was enough people that were uncomfortable with that model that they were more powerful than people that didn't want to be dogmatic, didn't want to force control. In a way, people that want to force control will often very easily overpower those that don't want to force control, right? And so I think these are some really problematic components at play for Christianity if it's to survive. I think your 10% statistic, that's pretty generous. I would have said probably a much higher number, but I don't know. I see it from being over in the UK where, some parts of the UK, 2% identify as Christian. It's such tiny amounts in some of the parts of the UK. And we were starting to see the sort of exodus that America's seeing. We were starting to see that, 70, 60 years ago. And the drop off is sharp on our scales when you look across government pollings and surveys. And I wonder, I don't know, America's such a different nation. It really is so unique. It's really hard to look at other countries and go, will it follow the same trajectory? Will it do it differently? I don't know. They're doing it in the age of the internet, whereas we did it in the age of, World War II just finished, so we had different resources. We didn't have if I'm not this type of Christian, I can be a different type of Christian. It was just like, well, I'll just be an atheist. That was two options almost. Whereas now people have the internet and stuff. But I don't know. It was kind of rambling, but jump in, please.
Yeah. Well, I think they're important points. I think part of the purpose of the book is that it can lay out a thought process that someone or some group can go through and decide where they land. I think the Christian Snapshot can also help, even at a group or a congregational level, just to so you're not spinning around trying to decide what it is you're actually trying to say, to try to say, okay, here's what we believe as a group. Let's talk about that. And it won't be the first time that somebody split off from a church and created another church. That's how we got 300,000 of them, here in the United States. But I do think the book and Christianity Without Dogma, or Christian consciousness in general, is not for people who believe Christianity is perfect just the way it is. And it is not for people who are paid by the church to defend the faith. It's really for people who are deconstructing, who think there's a better way, who are not reacting against the church being like Jesus. They're reacting against the church being unlike Jesus. And so it would happen one person at a time, one group at a time, one church at a time. But if you follow the trends, the alternative is, there will be, it's not like there will be a middle way. There will be just a very shrinking body, and the rest of it, because there's no reasonably conscious alternative, then they'll just leave. And that's essentially what's happening right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. And I think I get excited seeing different communities arising, different ways of doing church, different ways of gathering. Me and my wife talking about this over the pandemic. It's been really hard to see our friends, and me and my wife are probably more risk averse than most regarding that. Me even more so than my wife probably, and that's been different in how it affects community. And you do start to go, I miss. So before the pandemic, we would get together at least once a week with our larger group of friends and meet for brunch, and or we do something active, do something like that. But frequently, multiple times a week, we were doing that. And to go from that to nothing, it starves you. It really hits you hard. And it was a good reminder for me of how hard early deconstruction can be. Because I'm quite disconnected from that a lot of people go through that all to nothing, that regular seeing people multiple times a week to nothing. And I do think that that's a real starvation of connection and of community. That's the number one metric people consistently say they miss. And so I think, from a business perspective, I look at it and go, pastors would be nuts not to adapt. But of course, it's not to the pastor. It's not a business. It is this very embodied faith that I'm doing just the right way. And if doing it the right way is how you're saved and you go to heaven, it takes a big step to go, maybe I've been doing it the wrong way. Right. Because that's questioning, was I even saved? Was I even right? Because if my dogma is what saved me, it's a real challenge to unpack that. Right. But I think you're right that organizations tend to change when there's enough pain. I think once churches get to the point where there's 10 members, they start to go, once churches get to the point where they're deciding, should we turn on the heating this Sunday or should we tell people to bring blankets? They're starting to go, maybe we need to adapt. Maybe we need to change. Now, sometimes the ways they change is ridiculous, right? It's like, well, let's open a coffee shop. And it's like, that's why the millennials left the church. They couldn't get coffee before the service. So sometimes you're like, oh, now you've got a smoke machine. People will come flooding, I'm sure. But I think there is probably more and more people that are questioning. And I think I personally, behind the scenes, people don't see this, but I talk to pastors every day. I talk to a new pastor probably at least once every 2 or 3 days. And I'm talking to regular pastors daily, all the time, talking to them. And they're going through the same hard process, but even harder because your whole, financial life and everything is built into your house. Your
tragedy.
But what's interesting is those pastors, most of them don't want to completely up and leave. At least not their faith. And a lot of them would love to bring their community on with them. And I think we can all say the same. When we started to deconstruct, we did think, it'd be great if my parents believed like this and went on this exciting journey with me as well. What's maybe more healthy and more whatever. Now, we all know then what happened when you told your parents, right? or we all know why we didn't tell our parents, because we also knew that it would end everything and it would blow up. So it's this very complex component, but I think there is a lot of pastors out there that want to change. There's a lot of pastors out there that desire that. I think the question is, can you change the organization, or do you need to start a new organization? I think that's often a very big question. And I'd probably lean to the second dynamic. I think that's very likely. I've seen actual churches close and then plant themselves the next week as a new church, because they see it as you have to have this clean line. And what's funny is most of them are identical. They've changed nothing. Maybe a different elder or something. But it's a really fascinating topic, and it's one that's close to my heart. I think it's close to most of our hearts because we grew up Christian. We are deeply involved in this. A lot of us see a lot of healthy components. I was thinking about the food banks in the UK. We're in a terrible situation with our government, and poverty is through the roof right now. And there's a huge amount of people in the country that can't feed themselves. In a country of 60 plus million, I think it's about 4 million people every week rely on food banks. They would not be able to feed themselves and their kids if there wasn't food banks. But what's interesting is the government doesn't put those food banks on. Christians do. Most of the food banks in the UK are run by churches. They're funded by churches. They're volunteered by churches. Now, lots of other people, atheists, agnostics, get involved with these, absolutely. And there's plenty of organizations that aren't Christian, but the majority of them are. And you'd be hard pressed to say, they're a bunch of dicks. What terrible people. They're great people, wonderful. And it's such a complex thing that we're navigating. And I love that you're diving into the weeds of the complexities, and you're kind of tugging out these big weeds of dogma that go unquestioned largely. And I think those are the things that need to go so that we can start looking at what can be saved, what can be brought forward with us. These are the big things.
I think, because I think organizations are a big part of the problem, but they're also a big part of the solution for the reasons that you're talking about. You can't help, 1 million or 2 million or however many people without organizations. So organizations are important, and dogma has turned into a catalyst for people leaving the faith as opposed to people growing the faith in most cases. Every church is different. I don't think any church, it'll sound crass maybe, but any church that's making money is not going to change what they're going to do. Period. Whether they think it's the right thing or not. But those who are struggling, or people who are moving somewhere else, then I think taking a look at Christianity Without Dogma as organizationally, which is a chapter on that, is something to at least look at. But I think when you look at the book itself, I did believe that dogma was the foundation of the faith.
Me too.
No doubt. And so the book, and so I write the book in a way as if I were talking to my pastor in 1975 on how I got here. And so I, piece by piece, go through a dogmatic view to a non-dogmatic view of Christianity through the book. And then when you take the Christian Snapshot, whether you read the book or not, it at least gives you a language and a framework for thinking about your own journey. And from what I've seen, and you've helped me a lot with this personally, Phil, people who are deconstructing are in a very bad spot because they've got everything that they believed was true growing up to a certain age. They've got a ton of peer pressure and parental pressure and all sorts of other pressures not to change. It's a very complicated subject. Part of them would just rather stay and not, bite the man. But there's another part of them that in their heart, they know they just can't live with themselves anymore. And so how do you get from, where you want to go from where you've been? And I don't think that there's a path to Christianity without going through a process like that. The other path is deconversion. And so if you don't want to deconvert, then this is a path to at least consider.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating to me is I've not met anyone that wanted to deconvert, right? I've met a lot of people that have, like so many people. But I if you grew up in the church as a Christian, deconversion is scary, right? That's the scary, do not go there, you'll go to hell kind of idea. You need to deconstruct a lot of different ideas before you're in a place where you're even comfortable talking about or thinking about deconverting. And I think what I find with your book is I think it will be really, really helpful to so many people that are in that place where they don't want to deconvert. They want to, see what can be salvaged Christianity. How do I work through the process of what is Christianity? What comes, what goes, why are we here? Like, how can we maybe build something more beautiful on the other side? And I think of the people that do that, I think there'll be a large percentage, whatever it might be, 15, 20, 40%, that then keep moving and ultimately deconvert or move into something else, maybe go into Buddhism or atheism or agnostic, and they just go, no, I'm not a Christian. The Jesus thing's not for me. I don't know what I am. I'm spiritual or religious, whatever it might be. There'll be so many different things. But I do think a lot of people will land. I see this again and again and again, that people that deconstruct often land somewhere within Christianity. There's, of course, there's a lot of people that still identify as Christian that are deconstructing that, haven't outed themselves, haven't left their church, haven't, or maybe are just at the baby stages of that process. And so, of course, that's going to skew the numbers. If we said like everyone starts in London and you have to walk to, somewhere outside of London. And then we said, wow, 30% are in London. Well, of course, they've just started, so to some degree, like I think the numbers will always skew more Christian, but I think whatever numbers we look at, there's going to be a good portion of people that will, like you, go, there is a way to do this more beautifully, more authentically, more autonomously, one where I am the master of my own faith and identity and pursuit of God, the divine, spirituality, bettering humanity, bettering myself, whatever this looks like. And I think your book is really fantastic for that. I know there's a couple other books similar. I know Mark Karras has a book. I talked to him about that, and Keith Giles has touched on this in some of his writings. But I think what you've done is really, really clever in that, taking people through your own journey of the spiritual process of untangling yourself from dogma, but also the hopeful possibility of moving into something that looks less dogmatic. I don't know. Maybe it's dogmatic in a good way. I don't know. We could say that love being the answer is unprovable, I guess, as well. In some way. But if we're gonna be picking something unprovable, let's pick love. Let's pick connection. Let's pick serving fellow humans, or the planet and others. Like that just makes good sense. If we're going to pick something unprovable, let's not pick. Let's go and picket the gays or attack, whatever.
Absolutely.
I don't know, pick some group that Christians love to attack, what a terrible way to be undogmatic, be dogmatic. Just pick something way more healthy would be a much better option. And I think you give people a great path to do that. And so I think people listening, that go, oh, that's what I need. And I think there'll be a lot of people that do. I really think your book is for them. There's maybe people that find themselves post that journey. I really tried to stay Christian and I couldn't. I think some might get benefit coming back and revisiting, but a lot won't. And so I would push that on. I know you're not pushing it on anyone to do that, but I really am excited and I'm really hopeful. The Christian Snapshot thing, you touched on it there of how it could be used in a church. I think we talked about this briefly, but I got so excited about this idea of what does it look like for a pastor to just put every person in their congregation, can you fill out this survey? And it's completely anonymized. The pastor doesn't know who it is. And he comes back and he looks at the results and it says 70% of your congregation rally around helping people. That's what they really believe this faith is about. And he's going, God, I haven't talked about helping people from the pulpit for 4 months. What am I doing? I'm talking about, why the Bible is the word of God, and 42% don't even believe the Bible is the word of God, and 30% say it's not that important either way. And you go, gosh, what am I doing? Maybe they double down. Maybe why I need to really preach this now so they believe it. But I think it could be really helpful for a whole bunch of people in these different places, right from the pastor who's in there struggling, wanting to change things, right through to people that are in a position you're saying of tearing your hair out is a really hard process to go through. This is not a fun process. And I think the beauty is that you have navigated this for many years now. You've kind of got to the point now where you can look back at the process and kind of articulate it really well. And so, I'm really, really excited about it. Is there anything else in the book that you kind of wanted to touch on or some of the themes of the book? I'm trying to rack my brain. I feel a bit out of it today, but we've got probably about 15 minutes or so, do we? Yeah.
Well, I think I think it covers it pretty well. What you've done. I think, again, you've helped a tremendous amount for this, and I have to thank you personally. It wouldn't have been anywhere near the book that it is had you not helped and given your insights and reached out to your community, and it just helped a tremendous amount.
Well, thank you. Absolute honor to help people in this. And for people listening, some of you did help Jack in the creation of this book by taking part in his Christian Snapshot and stuff like that. But yeah. Oh, well, Jack, I reckon we should probably finish on a high. And if people, so the book is out for pre-order. Is that right?
It's out for pre-order as we speak, and it'll be available for sale on Amazon at the end of January. Brilliant. And Christian Snapshot's available 24/7. So christiansnapshot.com. And if somebody's interested, they can take the survey. It goes through 28 different characteristics, and they'll get their report immediately.
It's brilliant. And there's so many ways to engage with that as well. I've not looked at the website recently to see if you kind of highlight that, but like you can do the Christian Snapshot and compare yourself to yourself in the past. You can do it and compare itself to your mother-in-law. You can do it and compare it to your pastor or someone, or you could do it just at the church and, you know, see where are you changing and how are you identifying in comparison to like the organization you're a part of.
And I think even, really helpful. Two people who are living together and are deconstructing either together, or one's deconstructing and one's not, you know, that can be so gut-wrenching.
That'd be huge.
To have each of them take it, and there's a designated peer, as you know, and you can have your significant other, you know, what you think, just kind of like what you were saying about your father. So you can kind of think, you know, my partner, I would think that my partner thinks this. And if they did the same thing, then you can kind of see, you know, where are we right about each other? Where are we wrong about each other? And where are we different from each other?
Yeah. And it is probably one of the few cases where you probably would be as safe as you can be to sit down with your partner and go, look, we're going through a spiritual process. One of us is deconstructing, one isn't, but you know, it's hard for us, but maybe we could do this together. We could look at the data together. We could try and think, you know, how are we moving forward? I think that'd create some very helpful avenues to pursue. There's not that many resources out there. I know David Hatewood, the Naked Pastor, has a resource for people that are deconstructing. And I really recommend, if people are struggling in that area, it's is it Till Doubt Do Us Part, it's called. You can find that on bookstores, Amazon and stuff, but there's not much out there. And I think something like the Christian Snapshot again would show, oh gosh, we actually still believe a lot of the same values, or these are the areas we really disagree. Maybe we can revisit this in a month and talk about it and just think about it from the other person's perspective. And because this is, gosh, you think it's hard deconstructing and, you know, you don't want to talk to your pastor about it. Imagine like being, and a lot of your listeners do not need to imagine, but, you know, being married to someone and doing this and they're not, or vice versa, is hard. I talk to so many people that aren't deconstructing. They message me and go, my wife or my husband is deconstructing. How do I support them? How do is my marriage over? Are they going to just walk away from God and I'm going to have to divorce them? Or it's really hard for everyone involved. And I think it's another way the tool could be used. It's really exciting. So it's christiansnapshot.com. And the book is Christianity Without Dogma. And you can get that online. Jack, that's amazing. If people want to reach out to you as well, you're on Instagram as well, aren't they? They can kind of track with some of your posts that you're doing and stuff. And that's Christian Consciousness, is it?
It's ChristianConsciousness.org. And
ChristianConsciousness.org.
And there's a website, ChristianConsciousness.org.
Brilliant.
But on Instagram, it's ChristianConsciousness.org.
Wonderful. Well, Jack, honestly, this has been fantastic. I've loved it. It's been a real pleasure to have you on. Kickstart 2022.
Thanks for everything. It's been great.
Yeah, of course. All right. Wonderful. Well, I'll catch you later. If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.